Like any labor of love, Red Alert 2's campaign is filled with Easter eggs, many of which are easy to miss when one is simply trying to have a good time. Then there are the other obscurities, things left on the cutting room floor, never to see the light of day unless one delves deep behind the scenes. And it just so recently dawned on me that despite being a longtime fan of this decades-old game, I've never actually went into the map editor to see how the original campaigns were created, how the triggers were set up, and what kind of mission-specific changes the developers had made. This video is my attempt to share those findings. It's time for a behind-the-scenes trivia trip. Before we start, you need to be filled in with some basic info. At the center of all RA2 modding lies the rules.ini file, which, as the name suggests, contains the rules for the game, including the properties of every single technotype that exists in the files. Technotype is an umbrella term for all interactable objects in the game. That means infantry, vehicles, aircraft, and buildings. Each technotype contains an assortment of ini flags that define their behavior. Notably, these ini flags can be overridden by defining them within a map file, and those arbitrary changes will always take priority over the base rules in said maps. This forms the basis of campaign-specific changes in RA2. Now let's properly begin. Campaign-specific stat changes are a historic commonality in the CNC franchise, all in the good name of streamlining player experience. This one is no exception. Red Dawn marks the beginning of the Soviet campaign, with some of the most gameplay warping changes done to a single unit, the conscript. Here are the set of changes in the map file. Its name is changed from conscript to conscript. Armor type is changed from flak to none. Sight changed from 5 to 9. Speed 4 to 7. And strength 125 to 100. Seeing as how this is the only Soviet combat unit you can produce in this mission, to have them walk across the entire map at a normal infantry pace was deemed far too slow for an opening act. As such, their speed was boosted to dog levels, and compensated with a slight armor and HP nerf befitting their prominent usage in human wave tactics.
Commander, pay no heed to casualties. For every conscript who dies in this crusade, there are 1,000 more who stand eager to replace him.
The Engineer and War Miner similarly received speed buffs in this mission, but there is another curious change to the War Miner in the file as well. Storage reduced from 40 to 20, half of what they are in the standard rules, which will put them at the same storage capacity as the Chrono Miner, if the latter storage wasn't halved in the map file as well. As the name suggests, this flag defines how much ore the miner could store before they need to deposit them at the refinery. A lower storage means more time spent traveling to the refinery and back, which means an overall lower income. That would be the case here if it weren't for the fact that the cash value of ores are also doubled in this mission. This is no isolated incident, mind you. In fact, every single mission of vanilla RA2 halves the storage of both harvesters and doubles the cash value of all ore types. So you're actually earning more money than you would in skirmish. You might think this is a weird thing for the developers to do. After all, can't they just change the default values in the rules file? Why go through the effort of redefining them to the same value in every mission? The best answer I could come up with is that this is a safety measure to make sure the campaign's economy isn't affected by any future updates tailored for multiplayer. I mentioned at the beginning that rule changes defined in the map itself will always override the same flags in the base rules file. Therefore, consistent flag overrides like the harvester storage changes can be used to make sure that no subsequent changes to the game's rules file post-launch, be it for multiplayer or skirmish purposes, will interfere with the campaign's balancing. So, it's likely that in an earlier version of the game, harvesters and ore fields were designed with these values, and missions were balanced with them in mind. And later on, the storage and ore values were adjusted to nerf the economy for skirmish and multiplayer. Imagine what would have happened if these safeguards weren't in place and the nerfs were harsher than they are now. You'd be complaining non-stop about the campaign being too hard instead. And that's a hypothetical scenario that CNC players would be very familiar with, because that's exactly what happened in the infamous patch 1.09 of Tiberium Wars, which reduced the carrying capacity of harvesters by roughly 42% for multiplayer balancing reason, but retroactively applied this change to the campaign as well, significantly increasing the difficulty.
Insufficient funds.
So honestly, kudos to the devs for doing this. There's other stat changes in Red Dawn as well, so we should probably move on now. One thing Yuri's Revenge modders might not notice at a glance is that the Soviet player actually has their attack range inside garrison buildings increased to 8. This change is obviously intended to help player experience with their introduction to garrisoning. The most apparent result of this change is at this choke point right before the Allied construction yard. With a buffed garrison attack range, conscripts can actually damage both pillboxes from either of the two garrisonable buildings. The reason I say this might not be noticed by Yuri's Revenge modders is because vanilla RA2 uses a separate mechanic for garrison weapons. Each garrisonable building in the rules is defined with a primary and secondary weapon, Allied Occupy W and Soviet Occupy W respectively. RA2 only supports 2 types of weapons on each technotype, and it just so happens that there's only 2 units that can garrison buildings in this game, GIs and conscripts. A good programmer is a lazy programmer, as they say. Of course, all that had to be reworked with the introduction of initiates in Yuri's Revenge. A new flag called Occupy Weapon replaces the base RA2 logic by placing the code for weapon fired when garrisoning a building as part of the infantry's code instead. Funnily enough, it was this need for Westwood to extend their occupier logic that made it possible to add new occupiers with their own weapons in the myriad of mods that followed. One more thing for this mission. There's actually a small patch of land to the bottom right corner of the map, with trees shaped into the letters ACC planted on it. Using the paradrop function to get some conscripts onto this land will reveal the following texts. These are the initials of designer Timothy Scott Campbell and his wife Alicia, with the date being their wedding anniversary. A similar Easter egg is also found on the Warcraft 3 mission, Black Rock and Roll. Hostile Shores marks the end of the tyrannical reign of conscripts. Now they revert to being slow pieces of shit just like every other infantry. Anyway, the star of the show this time is the only Soviet unique unit that appears in the campaign, Vladimir's command ship, Vlad for short. Compared to a regular dreadnought, Vlad has 10,000 HP, 120 spawn regen rate, and 9 speed. Spawn regen rate dictates the number of frames needed for Vladimir to regenerate his dreadnought missiles, which is actually 40 frames higher than the normal dreadnought. Additionally, its weapon has a range of 35, 10 more than the base dreadnought. If Vladimir wasn't a wuss, he could have single-handedly killed everyone here without our help. Instead, all he does is bombard a beach resort, aggro some enemy destroyers, then run away. There's actually a disabled trigger loop that would have had Vladimir return sometime after leaving, where he then goes on to destroy some more beach resorts, gets hit by the enemy in the process, which leads to him running away again while triggering a destroyer to come attack us. Or at least that's what the triggers should have done. I've re-enabled them to see if they still work properly, but instead of running away when he's hit by an allied destroyer, Vladimir instead completely ignores them. And after he finishes destroying the beach resorts, he runs back to this specific waypoint, then proceeds to do nothing else but bombard this area where the oil barrels are at the start, destroying half of my base in the process. I'm not exactly sure what bugged out this chain of triggers, but even if we did fix it to work as intended, it's still pretty apparent why it was scrapped. Having Vladimir constantly aggro enemy destroyers to come attack your base would have been extremely frustrating to deal with, especially in this mission where the Osprey's damage is doubled for some reason. Most people know that these refineries near the starting beach will give you money crates if you capture them. What you might not have noticed though is that allied refineries have their power consumption reduced from 50 to 0, presumably so the player doesn't go out of power and feel like they're being punished for capturing these buildings. This whole shoreline attack segment at the start was supposed to be way more intense than what we got anyway, but I guess they toned it down in fear of players becoming overzealous and destroying these refineries in the process. There's a set of changes related to grand cannons in the map files, but this defense building doesn't make its debut until... No, wait a minute, this thing never appears in the Soviet campaign. Combined with a significant HP buff to the Soviet transport, it's likely that an earlier draft of this mission featured a much more fortified allied position. Unfortunately, we ended up with just a few pillboxes in the final version. Hell, even the sandbags protecting them were nerfed as well, a far cry from what could have been. The communications center building was also supposed to appear as an objective here, with its name changed to command center accordingly. I used to think this mission and the RA2 campaign as a whole was absolute cinema, and to be fair it was for its time, but it's always fun to ponder on what could have been. Last bit of trivia in this mission is that thatched huts have their names changed to Cabana Bar, an extremely minor detail, but it's precisely small things like this that helped forge RA2's timeless charm. Big Apple is a mission that somehow contains both good and bad scripting. For starters, we're introducing the players to the oil derrick, a universally beloved money printer with absolutely no downsides and never explodes. That's true, by the way. The oil derrick's explosion property was turned off in this mission, probably because it's right in front of our base and thus extremely vulnerable to enemy attacks. The mission itself doesn't have much going on until you capture the Allied Battle Lab. Hidden at the top right corner of the map is a Soviet base with all the necessary tech requirements to construct a psychic beacon. In order for AI to construct a building at a specified location, mappers needed to use the base node function to sort of pre-place buildings on the map. You can think of base nodes as ghost buildings that the AI will always construct if they have access to the tech requirements and a construction yard. In this case, once the Allied Battle Lab is captured by the player and sold off, the Psychic Beacon base node at the same location becomes unobstructed, and the AI immediately constructs the vital building. This process can be simplified greatly in Yuri's Revenge with additional trigger actions, but that is a tale for another time. For some reason, there is also this Psychic Sensor base node nearby, possibly misplaced or something left over from a previous iteration. Since it belongs to the neutral house which has no means to construct it, it doesn't do anything. In the ensuing defense segment, allied units will continuously spawn around the map and attack your position. Notice how I said around the map instead of off the map, because that's exactly what happens. The spawning waypoints are placed well within a player's vision, so if you were looking at the right place, you can actually see 6 grizzly tanks magically appear out of thin air, stacked on top of each other. I managed to abuse this in my Deathless run of the Soviet campaign, but outside of challenge run benefits, spawning reinforcements within a player's view is just terrible practice. There's a reason maps have a visible area setting that is often different from the map's actual size, often for this exact purpose. The mapper does redeem themselves later on with some ingenious scripting. When the Psychic Beacon activates and mind controls all the enemies, the entire map flashes red as it does before returning to normal momentarily after. This lighting change is easy to script in Yuri's Revenge with the use of the retint blue, red, and green trigger actions. but they don't exist in base RA2. The mapper's ingenious workaround was to summon a lightning storm when the beacon activates, and change its related light settings to simulate the beacon's red glow. The reason you don't actually see any lightning storms is because the lightning hit delay is set to 40,000, so the mission ends before it can manifest itself. Homefront is the first Soviet mission featuring the Snow Theater, which means you get to enjoy all the new snow-themed building sprites. Yay! Except the naval shipyard. For some reason, despite having all the files named properly, the Soviet shipyard's Arctic and generic sprites are actually the exact same. That is not the case for the Allied shipyard, which does have a proper Arctic variant of its sprites. Did they have a snow variant made and just accidentally included the same files under a different name? Well, as far as I know, this wasn't fixed in Yuri's Revenge, so who knows. The map file contains an entry named Briefing, which isn't actually a legal INI flag. Looking inside reveals this line of text. I guess the mapper was just having a bit of fun. The Allied destroyer has its main cannon range increased from 8 to 10 in this mission. A confusing buff at a glance, as there isn't really anything that seems to warrant a stat change like this. That is, until you realize that the buff destroyer can now reach your construction yard, so it's a reverse incentive for the player to not abandon their naval front. Of course, you could just move your MCV a bit further inland at the start to avoid this issue. There is a disabled trigger in the map editor named Zofia Re-Intruders, which plays the Zofia voice line to introduce the intruder.
The Allied intruder is an airborne threat to any of our forces who do not have adequate anti-air support. It does not stand up well to flak, Commander.
This voice line was presumably cut because the Allied jet had its name changed to Harrier at the last minute, which is a bit of an interesting trivia on its own. It's named the Intruder in the rules file. Its voxel is shaped more like an intruder than a Harrier, and this cut voice line also refers to it as an intruder. The most likely reason for the last-minute name change then is probably because the real-life Harrier is a proper VTOL aircraft, so a conventional takeoff jet like the Intruder wouldn't have made sense with the Allied Air Force HQ's landing pads. Now that I look at it, City of Lights is quite a small map even by RA2 standards. Perhaps incidentally, it's also got the least amount of stuff to talk about. The Soviet barracks and Tesla coil are both modified to have 0 power, so that you don't go into low power mode and have your production rate kneecapped. Aside from that, the only other notable changes are the ones done to the Eiffel Tower, though most are just precautions, like making it so that you can't attach Ivan bombs to it, making it so that it works with Tesla Trooper overcharge logic, and giving it 30,000 health to make sure it never dies. The most interesting bit of this mission, however, is the fact that you don't actually own any Tesla Troopers, not even the ones you recruit yourself. In RA2, the player is assigned a primary house in every mission. This is the house they see the interface of, build the units of, and checks all related prerequisites of. However, the player is still able to control the units of other houses if they have the INI flag player control equals yes. How does that come into play here? Well, the goal of this mission is to get a Tesla Trooper near the Eiffel Tower to supercharge it. We check for this by placing cell tags around the Eiffel Tower, and if a Tesla Trooper steps onto any of them, then we know the player has completed the objective. There's just one small problem though. We don't have a trigger condition that lets us check for a specific technotype. What we can check instead is whether the cell tags are entered not by a specific technotype, but by any technotype of a specific house. And then we just put all the Tesla Troopers the player owns under that house instead. In this case, the other 3 house. That's right, every single Tesla Trooper you start the mission with or encounter as reinforcements on the map are all under the other 3 house. Every single Tesla Trooper you build from your barracks is only yours for a split second before its house is changed to other 3. Now just give the player control of other 3 and change its color back to red, and the deception is complete. Quite an ingenious solution in my opinion. If there's an award for missions with the most missed potential, Subdivide would take that win by a long shot. First, we've got the Korean fleet, which again spawns within the player's view instead of off-map, making for an extremely lackluster entrance and easily abused one too for a deathless run. Secondly, the Allied AI in this mission was supposed to be a lot more active and aggressive, with a set of fully fleshed out AI triggers made and ready to be used. But the trigger that enables said AI triggers is disabled in the final release, so Blue literally doesn't do anything outside of a few scripted attacks. That means 2 waves of scripted transport attacks, a trigger that sends 4 carriers to attack you 400 frames after the Koreans arrive, another trigger that sends a carrier to attack your Konyard 1400 frames after the Koreans arrive, and after that, nothing. Had these disabled triggers and AI triggers been enabled, the player would have faced far more carriers, Aegises, destroyers, rocketeers, harriers, ground defenders, and lots more amphibious attacks. Maybe Westwood thought it was too big of a difficulty departure from the previous missions, but I wish they had at least left it in for the hard difficulty. So naturally, I tried to enable them myself. Except when I did that, the AI didn't really do much still. It does send new attack teams like Destroyers and Harriers now, but they do so at such a low frequency that it's functionally no different from having them turned off. Of course, I did some digging to try to find what the issue was, only to unveil a whole new layer of Westwood spaghetti. It all starts with the ini flag named team delays, which defines the interval between team creation by the AI, with 3 values corresponding to 3 campaign difficulties. Developers often leave comments behind in the rules file to help clarify things for each other. Unfortunately, whoever wrote the comment for team delays got the order of the difficulties backwards. It's not easy, medium, hard, but hard, medium, and easy instead. Presumably, whoever was responsible for Subdivide had read this comment and then went on to modify the team delays according to the wrong difficulty order. I can't believe I'm saying this, but yes, Subdivide is easier on hard and harder on easy. Chrono Defense is a relaxing mission. Maybe a bit too much. As soon as you set up a fortified perimeter, the mission just kinda plays itself with the remainder. The Soviet Battle Lab's HP is also buffed to prevent it from being one-shot by Harriers, so the player has plenty of attention and funds left to explore around, notably towards the village to the west. There is a side objective here where you have to destroy a propaganda truck, or they'll periodically send brainwashed civilians in attack waves against you. These civilians are given the Pistol A weapon in this map, so that they can actually attack us, and each have an ammo of 100. Curiously, however, the Technician sprite, on top of having ammo 100, also has reload equals 80, which is a flag that specifies the base delay in frames between automatic reloading of each round of ammunition. Since Pistol A has a rate of fire of 20, meaning it fires a shot every 20 frames, the Technician should run out of ammo eventually and would need to regenerate. The default value for this reload flag is 0, which, if we assume it works on the aforementioned principle, means they will instantly reload and always have ammo. And since this flag isn't specified in the base rules, the expected outcome would then be Snow civilians never run out of ammo and keep on firing, while the Technicians should run out of ammo eventually and will need to regenerate them. In practice, the Snow civilians start playing their panic animation once all 100 rounds are fired, after which they somehow regain all their ammo and go back to firing just fine. Meanwhile, the Technician permanently runs out of ammo and is never able to fire again. The only logical explanation is that the reload logic as a whole is completely busted in vanilla RA2, which is highly likely because that is the case in Tiberian Sun, the game whose engine RA2 is based upon. This would also explain why the reload flag is never used in the base rules. Another fun quirk in this mission are these loaded trucks that spawn crates when destroyed. This behavior by itself isn't exactly original to this mission, but whereas most truck crates are created with a trigger to enforce the spawning of a particular type of power-up, the trucks in this mission spawn crates using the carries crates equals yes flag, which spawns a random crate when destroyed. The chance distribution is altered, however, which I'll talk more about in the next mission. The basic gist of it is that they heavily limited the things you can get from the crates. Speaking of crates, ever wonder why there's a crater here on the high ground? Well, the thing is, Harrier attacks in this mission don't end their script with a delete team member action, which would have been good practice. This means once the Harrier reaches their exit waypoint, they simply crash, resulting in a crater. Mayday, mayday! Post-investigation Simonette here. Scratch what I just said. Turns out Westwood did remember to put delete team members as the last script action, except this action basically never worked with Jets in vanilla RA2. Not with the default ini rules anyway. After extensive testing, I found out that whether or not the deletion script works with Jets is related to several things. First of all, stray, which defines the radius in cells that AI-controlled team members can stray from their position without causing them to regroup. That description by itself doesn't sound like it has anything to do with the problem at hand, but for some reason changing this from 2 to 3 makes this work. I don't know. Secondly, to ensure the deletion script works consistently, the number of Jets in the task force itself can't be higher than 1. That's because each member of a task force will always wait for all of its other members to finish executing its previous script action before it moves on to the next one. So when you have more than 1 Jet in a task force, the Jet that reaches the waypoint first will have to wait for all the other Jets to arrive as well before it executes the deletion script. But Jets can't just hover in place in RA2, which leads to them crashing. In the case of this team in Chrono Defense, the task force consists of not 1 but 5 Harriers, which explains why they kept crashing. It won't be a CNC game without a little infighting for the bad guys. No better way to do that than melting them into radioactive sludge. The Desolator makes its debut in Desecration, and to make them feel more powerful, their weapon damage is increased from 125 to 200. There is very little ore near the player's starting location, leaving you strapped for cash early. As soon as you start destroying monuments and claiming money crates, however, you realize they give 8,000 credits instead of the standard 5,000 in this mission. A total of 5 monuments around the map should provide you with plenty of cash. The existence of loaded trucks means even more randomized crates in this mission as well, though their chance distribution is heavily altered just like the last mission. The standard crate goodies chance distribution looks something like this, adding up to a total of 110. These numbers are not percentages, but rather shares of the sum, so a value of 10 would be around 9.09% in the base rules. I don't know why they didn't stick to a total of 100 for a clearer percentage, but it is what it is. Anyway, the goodie distribution for Desecration looks something like this. As you can see, money crates have a significantly higher weight, and you can't get random units from it anymore. These money crates sadly do not benefit from the money crate buff. But hey, free money's money. Aside from crate shenanigans, the biggest point of interest on this map is this psychic beacon to the east. Destroying this beacon triggers a voice line from Zofia, telling us that all the Americans on the map have been freed from Vladimir's grasp. Yet none of the said Americans are seen changing back to their usual blue color, nor do they start fighting against Vladimir's forces. As usual, the suspect in question is Westwood Spaghetti. The trigger that's actually responsible for the house changing and even a crate reward, by the way, is set up incorrectly. Fixing this will make the Americans actually free from the beacon's control, but that doesn't really mean much because it's only a handful of GIs. The Fox and the Hound is the second and last Soviet mission to use standard houses for its triggers instead of custom ones. The first was Hostile Shores. We can possibly infer that these two missions were scripted by a different mapper compared to the rest, or they were simply reworked later during the development period. Whichever it was, kudos to the mapper because this was one of my favorite missions back then, in large part thanks to its sandbox design. The player has multiple ways to tackle the base on their own terms. You can mind control an IFV and bust open the side walls. You can mind control snipers to kill all the seals and dogs, then shut down the power with a spy. You can mind control the Black Hawk to airlift the Psy Corps troopers into the compound. You can call in paradrops, and you can infiltrate the Allied battle lab to use Chrono Ivans. It seems they also wanted you to be able to build jets at one point, as the Harrier has a change to its tech requirement in this mission. There's a whole bunch of stat changes to help smoothen the experience of each strategy, mostly just prerequisite shifts, range boost, and power changes. One standout, however, is the damage buff to the Black Hawk's primary weapon, which is increased from 35 to 75. Unfortunately, they forgot that the Black Hawk switches to an elite variant of its primary weapon when it gains elite veterancy, with its own set of stats in the rules, so the Black Hawk actually becomes weaker when you rank it up to elite in this mission. Aside from this small hiccup, the mission plays wonderfully. That being said, it's also got some sexist designs. Yeah, you heard me right, sexist mission design. Because the location is in Texas, and haha, Texans love guns, am I right? All civilians on the map carry firearms and will shoot you if you get too close. Oh, but not the female Texans though. Women don't carry guns in America, just a man. In all seriousness, they probably just forgot to give the female civilian a primary weapon in the rules. This mission actually has a pretty neat trick under the hood. The objective of this mission is to mind control President Dugan to make the Americans surrender. The main problem resides in the fact that Dugan has to survive the mind control process. Normally when you mind control a unit, its original allies will treat it as an enemy and immediately attempt to kill it. Dugan is in that exact situation, surrounded by a whole lot of guards. How do we make sure they don't instantly murder their president the moment we mind control him, but still allow them to open fire on the other Soviet units we control? The solution by the mapper was to allow the player to control multiple houses, just like in City of Lights. Here, the player's primary house is Latin Confederation, but the initial Psy Corps troopers they get are instead assigned to the African Empire house, which I've turned to the color green to make it easier to see. When the president is captured, a set of triggers fire immediately to create alliances between all the hostile houses and the African Empire house. This way, the American won't insta-kill their president, and they'll still be able to retaliate against the player's other units. An issue with this approach is that the player can't build nor fulfill technotype prerequisites using other houses' technotypes, even if that house is controlled by the player. Since we can only capture buildings at the start by mind-controlling engineers, these captured buildings will all belong to the African Empire house instead of the player's Latin Confederation house. To deal with this, the mapper crafted another set of triggers that each check for the ownership of a building around the map, and whenever these buildings are captured, they're immediately converted to the player's house. All this work just for making sure that the president isn't instantly gunned down by his people. The biggest irony, however, is that all of this was completely unnecessary. The president already has the ini flag insignificant equals yes, which by itself makes the enemies ignore the president as a viable target. So all of this elaborate setup was for nothing. Weathered Alliance had the potential to be a great mission. Amphibious assaults, pushing from one island to the next, custom lightning storm triggers, building their own super weapon? And then they decided to ruin all the strategic depth by turbo-nerfing the weather controller's durability so that it can be one-shot by the nuke. I don't think I've ever set foot on the final island before, not until I had to make this video. Why play mission when you can just skip it with one button? On to the triggers in this mission. Did you ever wonder why the timer text for the first lightning storm is in red and all the subsequent ones are in blue? That's because the first lightning storm is a full one. When the weather controller is revealed, a trigger starts a global timer of 300 frames disguised as a super weapon timer, at the end of which another trigger activates that always casts a lightning storm at this location. It also spawns one-time lightning strikes at several waypoints across the entire map. Most are spawned over water, making them little more than theatrics. The player can only see global timers in the color of their house, which is why the first lightning storm timer is in red. After this sequence, the game properly enables the weather controller, which starts the actual super weapon timer, now in blue as it should be. It would appear at one point the weather controller was planned to be capturable. Doing so enables a different win trigger called winner bonus, which, on top of granting you victory, also enables a global variable named Smith Castle Destroyed. Global variables, as the name suggests, are a way for Westwood to keep track of certain things throughout different missions. This feature is used more prominently in the Allied campaign. When I checked the remaining Soviet missions, however, this global variable is never mentioned again. Westwood had likely planned for the player to gain some bonuses if they capture the weather controller, such as being able to construct it in Polar Storm, though it eventually fell through, and the winner bonus trigger was left enabled because the player had no way to activate it anyway. Or did they? Courtesy of good friend of the channel Allstar, we discovered a bug directly caused by this trigger. As you know, there are two win triggers in this mission, winner and winner bonus. The first is activated when the weather controller is destroyed. The second is activated when the weather controller is entered by a unit. Seems alright at a glance. I mean, the only unit that can enter the weather controller would be an engineer, right? Wrong! Nothing beats a Psychor Commando, and right now you can get one for free on this specific island as an Easter egg. The C4 attack logic, which is shared by Tanya, the SEALs, and the Psychor Commando, is coded as the unit first entering the building and then blowing it up after they exit. As you can probably guess, this attack logic fulfills the conditions for both winner and winner bonus, activating both sequentially. This, plus the fact that both victory triggers are made loopable for some reason, bugs out the mission and soft locks you. Your units will endlessly cheer as if you've won, but the victory screen will never come. This can be fixed easily if you just disable looping on the two victory triggers. Nevertheless, it was quite funny to witness such spaghetti unfold firsthand. Red Revolution is, by community consensus, the hardest mission of vanilla RE2. It would have been even harder if the logic for AI attack timing actually worked, but these flags are unfortunately obsolete in RE2. But you know what else you could do to make this harder though? Play it on easy. No, really. Turns out they made the same mistake they did for Subdivide, and the enemy sends attack teams way faster on easy than on hard. I checked around again, and turns out they did the same thing to Desecration as well. Now, keep in mind that a lot of triggers and AI triggers are disabled on lower difficulties, such as the ones that continuously send Psychor troopers to attack you in this mission. So in essence, what happens is that on higher difficulty, you face a larger variety of enemy attack teams, but at a much lower frequency, and vice versa for lower difficulties. In some situations, yes, that could actually make the mission harder. Unbelievable. Tim Campbell apparently wasn't satisfied with just one Easter egg dedicated to his marriage in the Soviet campaign. Here on this little hill, we can find the exact same Easter egg that appeared in Red Dawn. At least he was nice enough to give us some oil derricks in this mission, and reduce their explosion range by half so that you'd feel more inclined to send defenders near them. The Kremlin itself has its HP nerfed from the standard 1000 to 800 for some reason. It is also changed to be unoccupiable. If you ever see a Kremlin on a skirmish map, you can actually garrison it and it'll be slightly tougher than it is here. Bonus fun fact, the Kremlin's Temperate Theater sprite is shorter for some reason. If this was a reference to something, it has eluded me thus far. There is a trigger called Yuri Taunt Movie that plays a sidebar cutscene when Yuri mind controls one of your units. Or at least that was the intent. See, the event condition used here only works for technotypes attached with this trigger. And I'm guessing the mapper didn't know that because this trigger wasn't attached to anything the player owned. To properly script this interaction, you would have to recruit every unit the player builds into a team type with this trigger attached, which is a whole different beast on its own. Anyway, as a result of all this following cutscene never plays in the campaign.
Thank you, General. These are my men now. I can always use more.
Too bad, it would have been cool. Yuri has access to an Iron Curtain in this mission while the player doesn't. To make this advantage less overbearing, Iron Curtain's recharge time is doubled to 10 in-game minutes. Most people remember Yuri commenting on the stuff you build in this mission, a nice bit of immersion to fit with his mind-reading abilities. There are a total of 4 things Yuri will comment on: the construction of a war factory, of a Kirov, of a terror drone, and of a nuke silo. All these taunt voice lines will play only once, except for the nuke silo. Taking a closer look using the trigger analyzer will reveal that the nuke silo taunt is actually part of a repeating chain of triggers. When the player constructs the nuke silo, it triggers Yuri to taunt the player, followed by a Kirov attack wave from both sides of the map. If the nuke silo persists, more Kirov attack waves will follow every 200 frames. But if the player loses the nuke silo, rebuilding it will trigger the taunt voice line once again, with another wave of Kirov attacks immediately. So, theoretically, if you get some more Konyars to bring up your construction speed, you could repeatedly build and sell the nuke silo to trigger Yuri's secret Doomsday Armada.
Looks like our nuclear silo has been noticed.
You are not really planning to...
We had better get some Unit lost. Unit lost.
They really didn't want you to build nuke silos in this mission. Polar Storm is quite barren in terms of stat changes and whatnot. Outside of this one trigger that sends 2 destroyers to attack you, there's not much disabled content to talk about. Instead, we can talk about the Chrono Shift reinforcements in this mission. There is an initial wave of scripted Chrono Shift attacks on the player's starting island. The first wave is IFVs, arriving 260 frames after the game starts. 120 frames after that, 6 Grizzly tanks. Then a team of Seals 120 frames later. 1 carrier after 60 frames, then a final Grizzly attack after 120 frames. The Chrono Shift attacks on the starting island stop right here. All subsequent Chrono Shift attacks use a different set of repeatable triggers. This is the most complicated chain of triggers in the entire Soviet campaign. There are a few redundant connections here and there, but most of it is legible enough. Basically, there are 3 local variables being maintained in this mission: BG1 entered, BG2 entered, and BG3 entered. Each has a corresponding trigger attached to cell tags, and these cell tags are placed around 3 major ore fields on the map. When a unit owned by the player steps onto any of these cell tags, it enables the corresponding local variable and starts the trigger loop. First thing it does is it checks whether all units from previous Chrono Shift waves are destroyed, and only spawn the next wave if that's true. This is to ensure that these Chrono reinforcements don't stack on top of each other in a massive blob that eventually becomes undefeatable. Next, it checks which of the 3 local variables are enabled, then spawn a wave of Chrono reinforcements on each of the ore fields associated with said local variables. In total, there are 7 spawn triggers to account for all 7 combinations of local variable active states. For example, if you step on the cell tag surrounding this ore field, Chrono reinforcements will now periodically spawn at this waypoint. If you step onto this ore field, Chrono reinforcements will periodically spawn here as well. If you step on the cell tags for both the first and the second ore field, then Chrono reinforcements will spawn on both of them. You can probably infer what the remaining triggers do. But it wouldn't be classic Westwood mapping if they didn't make a little boo-boo here. The reinforcement trigger for BG1 plus BG3 checks whether BG1 entered is set to true, as it should, but then mistakenly checks whether BG3 entered is disabled instead of enabled. As a result, if you step on the BG1 ore field, you will trigger both the IFV Chrono attacks and the Prism Tank Chrono attacks, even though you're probably nowhere close to the BG3 ore field yet. Small mistake aside, this trigger loop is pretty well thought out. Normally, when you've expanded to an area of the map, your ore miners will naturally wander into the ore field there, thus stepping onto these cell tags. That's probably why Westwood used this way to check how far you've progressed through the mission. Though I don't know why they didn't just place a line of cell tags instead. The way it's set up currently, a player can complete the mission without facing any repeating reinforcements if they simply don't step onto any of these ore fields. That's the end of the Soviet campaign trivia trip. Deep diving into these maps has helped me a lot in understanding how some of the more confusing moments in the campaign worked under the hood. But it's also alleviated all the mystery surrounding these missions, perhaps for the worse. Knowing that the Allied base in Subdivide does literally nothing organic is a bit disheartening, to be sure. Make sure to let me know through appropriate channels if you guys enjoyed the video, and then maybe I'll make one for the Allied campaign. That is all for now. Until next time.